A very warm welcome once again to Moments of Grace, this time episode 19, Advent Ponderings with Canon Bob Wright. Bob, welcome.
Thank you very much, Bryce.
Now, Bob, we've just kind of met for the first time here on this Zoom, other than phone conversations, but you seem to have a last name that some of us here at Grace might recognize and might know somebody else with that last name. Is there any relation?
Well, actually, there is. I am the firstborn in the family, and my baby brother, I believe, is your dean at the cathedral.
Now that you mention it, I think I have met him.
Yes.
Any anecdotal stories about maybe even about Advent that you want to give us before we get rolling about Michael?
Well, I guess it's a terrible thing to say about one's brother, but I believe he's a very competent guy. And you know, I think it runs in the family, by God, I do.
Well, we'll do our best not to edit that compliment out about Michael when we go to air, but we'll keep it in about you no matter what.
Thank you.
Well, we're here to think about Advent. Scary to think that Advent is indeed right around the corner. It feels like we just emerged from Advent not too long ago. And I just want to think together about just a couple of themes about Advent. And our first one is about Advent in our childhood, which might sound a bit odd, but I find it quite an interesting one to latch onto, because I can say, I think out of all of the seasons, I grew up in the church, and I can say this, that Advent might have meant the most to me for very one good reason. Of course, it was building up to Christmas, and I kind of knew that, but there was something in the church that helped me know how close Christmas was, and that was the Advent candle wreath. And I can tell you that when I went in as a kid on a Sunday morning and there was only one candle lit, my level of excitement was pretty low. When there was two candles lit, I got a little bit more excited, but of course, when that fourth candle got lit, I was super excited because I knew Christmas was around the corner. So whoever invented the Advent wreath was brilliant for when it comes to kids. But I wonder about your experience as a child during the season of Advent, and maybe even how those childhood experiences have informed your Advents today.
Well, yes, and my experience of Advent Christmas is somewhat different than yours. And I grew up as my brother Michael did, as a preacher's kid. And my dad was an Anglican priest, and St. Augustine said that preachers were vendors of words. So I learned early the power of words, spoken or written. However, I confess I didn't always appreciate those words and his ability to describe them. But my mother was a singer of songs, and that's where I got my soul. And so even to this day, it seems that I often get more out of the music in the liturgy than I do the homily. But there is a ghost of Advent Christmas past in my upbringing. As a child, I remember particularly Christmas. It was wonderful. And for me, it was a time of light, and it was a time of gifts. The light for me was a heavily lit, huge Christmas tree, and the gifts were everything that was under that marvelous tree. But Advent, however, my experience wasn't as good as yours. Advent, for me, was a long, cold, we lived in Canada, and we live in Canada, a long wait in the dark. And I kept asking my mother, how come I have to wait so long to get something so wonderful? But I guess, as St. Paul said, when I was a child, I, of course, thought as a child. And much later, I learned that getting a gift meant that someone had to give it, and that my needs and my wants were only part of the story. And yet, I think I did get something important in that childhood. I learned that Christmas was about light and gift, as it is, of course. And I learned that that great lead up, which I later learned was called Advent was a time of waiting and listening and watching for signs that the wait would be worth it. While my learnings were pretty self-centered, I think I did catch a surface glimpse of those two seasons, which helped me immensely by being raised by a loving and patient parent.
Well, I think I can speak from a bit of experience of that, having grown up in Minnesota, the long, dark, cold winters.
Yeah.
And there's a reason I live in Charleston and not in Minnesota. So I completely resonate with all of that. And I probably can resonate a little bit, if not me personally, with many people who indeed find hymnody and choral anthems far more poignant and speaking more than the homily does, even though the homilist never really takes that fully on board, and we just go on as long as we want to, no matter what, don't we?
Yes.
What would you say if you had to boil it down? What is Advent really about? And you've already hinted at it, but if you had to boil it down and simply just say, I'm still wondering what Advent really is. I mean, what is it really about?
But that question's a little harder, and I don't claim to have an authoritative or a final answer to this. But strangely enough, largely because of your invitation, I've been thinking and seeking for a deeper meaning of what this season of Advent and its connection to Christmas might be. And a couple of weeks ago in the Gospel, you may recall, which was the 13th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus responds to the disciples' awe and wonder at the majesty of the temple, when they said, "What a temple, what a building, what stonework, what architecture." But his response is simply, that too will crumble in time. And then a little later on, the first four disciples to be called sit next to him on the hillside, and they say, "Well, tell us about what this end is about, and are we going to get some signs?" And Jesus again seems to ignore their need to know, but instead speaks of wars, leaders who lead followers astray, kingdoms rising against kingdoms, earthquakes, famines, all of which I think is pretty standard apocalyptic fare. And I've never really had a great interest in those things. But this year, I noticed I had a different response. Hearing those words made me just a touch anxious. I think because those words seemed a bit too descriptive of the world I find myself in today. 2021 is a world of pandemic, the ravages of climate change, and deep, dark divisions within our politics and our religious opinion. And I struggled to see any good news in that passage. And yet I think I may have discovered something in that anxious reading of this, and it has a lot to do with Advent and Christmas now. The hope which is expressed in that dark passage of division, disaster, and bad leadership. Jesus' response at the end, but these are just birth pangs, birth pangs. Leonard Cohen, who's one of Canada's best and best known poets, has written, "There's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in." And for me, the light and the hope seeps through this passage by the reminder that what I perceive to be happening in the world is terrible and frightening. Well, it can be seen as a birth pang, something about to be born. And surely part of the Advent message, at least this year for me, is not just that we are getting ready to celebrate the coming birth of the Christ child, but that the season, in fact, invites the disciple, the faith community, to bring fruition something that will enable us to bring about a change, a rebirth. Well, like birth, it can be painful. There are pangs and pain. It's slow, and much of it seems to take place in the dark. But the hope of the season surely is that when we come to celebrate the Savior's birth, we also recognize that something has changed within us. That's my hope. A new way of seeing, a fresh way of believing.
As you draw those parallels there, as you've just done, between the life that we are living, that all of us are living in the church, outside of the church, that we are living with these Advent themes, I wonder if you could give us some of maybe the best kind of maybe Advent practices as we live through these times, not just Advent, but what's going on in our world as well. Kind of the best Advent practices that not only can get us ready for Christmas, but might actually be practices that are good for the rest of our lives as well.
Well, let me begin with something that had an effect in your life, Bryce. The Advent wreath obviously has made a difference. So that's a great practice of really an approach to Christmas that reminds us it involves waiting, and there are stages to it. It doesn't happen automatically. And obviously that took for you. It took for me a lot longer, but that was a practice obviously that worked. Practical thing. I think there are two things that for me, I would say have been important. I've been helped enormously by the parables of Jesus, those story events in which Jesus speaks about the kingdom of God. And Advent reminds me that if you're going to learn from a story, especially the stories of Jesus, I have to practice what Advent requires of us all. Listen, watch, wait. The parables often begin, hear now, the parable. We need to begin with listening, and it seems that Advent says we're going nowhere unless we start by listening and watching. They are requirements for understanding a deeper faith, it seems to me. Well, for me now, I think Advent is more than a season. It is a way of seeing and hearing the good news each day, each week, each month, each year. And I need to be able to practice the Advent resource kit, in a sense. Always begins to listening to what's inside me, to my neighbor, to my faith community, to my enemies. And that is tricky at the best of times. But a very practical one for me, I began with a reference to my mother that helped inform my understanding of the arts. The arts have always befriended me in my faith journey because artists know a thing or two about giving birth to an idea, a composition, a work of art, a dance. And they also know about the work that's required, the hurt that is often involved, and the slow process of creation. My ministry has been deepened by the insights of the artists that have come into my life, and I am so much the better for it. And on occasion, it has kept my faith alive. So one of my recommendations this Advent might just be attend a concert, read a poem, attend a book signing. These experiences are transformative. And it seems that by taking time for ourselves through this busy season, we might find new ways, and who knows, good things might just take root and come to birth at Christmas.
Thank you so much for that. Those are wonderful, and I'm going to take those on board, absolutely. And I hope we all do here at Grace as well. Bob, thank you so much for being with us.
It has been my pleasure.
And I hope
say hello to Mikey for me, will you?
I will absolutely say hello to Michael for you, absolutely. I hope you have a blessed Advent and a joyous Christmas.
Thank you for this. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Peace.